Chapter 24. Emma. "Why can't I come?" Jenny whined as the girls got dressed. "Because you have school," Carrie said. "Besides, we will be quilting," Emma added. "I doubt you would have much fun." Jenny pouted and crossed her arms. "I never get to do anything fun. It's always just school, school, school." Emma smiled as she bit back her laugh. Sometimes Jenny sounded like such an old soul. "Come on, breakfast is waiting for us at the table." Carrie and Jenny followed her to the table where their father, Samuel, and Benjamin already sat. Doc Moore had his Bible open and was reading from the book of Psalms. Samuel appeared to be listening intently, but Benjamin's eyes kept glancing at the pancakes on the table. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, probably to keep himself from grabbing the delicious golden circles.
"Ah, the girls have arrived," Doc Moore said when he saw them. "Benjamin has been waiting patiently." "Or not so patiently," Samuel said with a smirk. Benjamin stuck out his tongue at his older brother as the girls took their seats around the table. "Can we pray for William's safety?" Emma's eyes sought her father's as the family grabbed hands. "Of course," Doc Moore agreed. "We will pray daily for his safety."
Around the table, heads bowed, and Doc Moore led them in prayer. When the last amen was uttered, the food flowed. They passed pancakes from one to the next, followed by the butter and some homemade jam. When the food disappeared, Emma and Carrie gathered the dishes and washed them quickly in the sink, placing them out to dry before gathering their quilting supplies. Jenny and Benjamin waited on the couch with their school pails on their laps ready to go. "All right, let's go." Emma opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Her siblings, all but Samuel, who was staying to work the farm, followed her out, and they began their trek to school. After dropping the younger two children off, Carrie and Emma continued to Kate's house. There were already a few other women in attendance, including Rebecca Johnson and Sarah Miller, whose parents owned the cafe. Emma and Carrie sat in empty chairs near Kate and began unloading their quilting supplies. "I'm sorry to hear about William," Sarah said. "Thank you." Emma pulled out a few of her favorite fabric pieces. "I'm just praying for his safety and hoping after this mission no other one calls him away. I love him, but I don't want to marry a bounty hunter who is always away." "Just because he stays here doesn't mean bad things won't happen to him," Rebecca mumbled. Emma understood she was referring to her late best friend, Pauline, who had been killed by outlaws during a bank robbery. "That is true, but at least the chances are smaller if he isn't out chasing the bad guys." A silence fell on the group. Kate cleared her throat and caught Emma's eyes. "What colors are you hoping to have in the house?" Emma sensed her friend was changing the subject, hoping to lighten the somber mood. "Oh, I have thought little about it." She paused and pictured her perfect house. "I guess light blue and beige. Ooh, I have a great fabric that matches that." Rebecca dug in her fabric bag for a minute and pulled out a large cotton square, checkered with a light blue pattern. "That is lovely," Emma agreed. "And wouldn't it look great next to this one?" Carrie produced a beige square with little flowers on it. With the topic of death forgotten, the women excitedly displayed their fabric squares and placed them together. Emma smiled as the pattern unfolded. William was sure to love it, if he made it home. William. Jack stirred as the sun filtered through the trees.
"Why did you let me sleep so long?"
He shot William a narrowed glare as he sat up and stretched. William smiled as he packed up his blanket.
"Well, first, it's not that late. 9 or 10, judging by the position of the sun. Second, I've done this enough times to know I'd rather have a well-rested man watching my back than a tired one." "But we're racing against time here, William. We don't have the luxury of sleep."
Jack quickly rolled up his blanket, tied it to the back of his saddle, and mounted his horse. With a shake of his head, William followed suit, and the men continued towards Barefoot Glen. William's heart tightened as they rode into town. It looked as he remembered, and he fought to keep the memory of Catherine's murder from resurfacing.
"Do you know where your sister lives?"
Jack asked. William shook his head and swallowed his emotion.
"Not exactly. I heard she moved outside of town when she married, but I never knew exactly where. We can check in at the sheriff's office. If my old boss still oversees the town, he might have an idea." "Sounds like a plan."
Jack motioned ahead of him.
"Lead the way."
William closed his eyes and took a deep breath.
"Please, God, give me the strength to be in this town again."
When he felt the peace descend, William opened his eyes and led the way to the sheriff's office, which was a small building nestled between the cafe and the post office. After dismounting, William secured the reins of his horse to the hitching post and led the way into the office. An older man with white hair and a matching mustache stood as they entered.
"Bill? Bill Cook?"
"Hey, Clarence." William removed his hat and nodded at his old boss.
"I go by William now. This here is my friend Jack."
"Nice to meet you, Jack."
Clarence stepped forward and extended a weathered, leathery hand. He was older and seemed a little more relaxed than William remembered.
"Same to you."
Jack returned the friendly gesture, but his tone was all business.
"Well, William, what can I do for you? I didn't think I'd be seeing you again after, you know."
William nodded and cleared his throat to remove the ball of emotion blocking it.
"Yes, I'm afraid we are here on business. Do you know where Mabel is living?"
"Mabel, your sister, but I thought you weren't on speaking terms."
Though generally a private family matter, William had been close enough to Clarence when he worked for him to have filled him in on the Rocky family situation.
"We aren't, but she might be in danger."
"Danger? What do you mean?"
Clarence's laid-back attitude disappeared, and he squared his shoulders, reminding William of the man he used to work for.
"John Holden escaped and is seeking revenge on the men who put him away,"
Jack said.
"but he seems to be going after families. Has anyone come into town asking for William?"
Clarence shook his head.
"Not here, but I doubt he would come here anyway. The saloon would be a better place to look."
"Maybe we should split up," William suggested. "I can go check on Mabel, and you two can ask around the saloon."
"I don't think you should go to Mabel's alone," Jack said. "If there's even a chance Holden got there first, it's too dangerous." "You two can head out to Mabel's," Clarence said. "I'll ask around at the saloon and head over with whatever information I find."
"Just be careful when you do," Jack said. "Holden is dangerous, and you need to prepare for any situation."
"Got it. I'll bring some good men with me. Here, let me show you where Mabel lives."
Clarence returned to the desk at the back of the room and pulled a map of the area from one drawer. William and Jack leaned in to watch as he pointed out their current location and how to get to Mabel's.
"Thanks, Clarence. Remember, be safe."
William shook his hand, thankful for his old friend.
"You too."
William nodded, and he and Jack left the building and mounted up once again, urging their horses toward the west end of town. As they left the main part of town, the houses grew further apart, and the trees became denser. Mabel's ranch was a few miles out of town, but as they grew closer, an ominous feeling descended on William. He scanned the area, not sure what he was looking for, but sure it would stand out when he found it.
"Jack."
His voice was quiet but urgent. Jack pulled his horse to a stop and looked over. William pointed to the horse tracks that had caught his eye. There were at least 4 different tracks, and they were spaced as if the horses had been separate, not attached to a wagon. Jack nodded and scanned the area again.
"He could be here already. Keep your eyes open. We must plan accordingly when we get closer."
When the ranch came into view, William and Jack dismounted and tied their horses to nearby trees in a grove that would hide them. 4 other horses stood tied to the house's porch.
"Let's get closer and see if we can see inside,"
Jack said. William nodded, his heartbeat pounding in his head with fear and adrenaline. The 2 crept up to the house, their eyes open for anything out of place. There was a large front window, but curtains closed off the view. Jack pointed to the left and motioned William to go right. William nodded and crept to the right. His fingers kept a permanent position near his gun. As he rounded the corner, a man came into view. His back was to William, but with his gun drawn and his head swiveling left and right, he appeared to be a lookout. William paused, unsure if the man was friendly or a foe. But when a shout from the inside caused no concern to the man who continued to stand guard, William decided he was one of Holden's men. After a deep breath and a silent prayer, William calmed his nerves and rushed the man, his gun drawn. The man turned just as William reached him, but he had no time to react. William brought the gun against the side of the man's head, and he dropped like a rock. Jack appeared a moment later as William was checking the man's pulse.
"He's alive, but he'll be out a while. Do you have something to secure him with?" "In my saddlebags. Why don't you try to get in the house and I'll take care of this one and join you?"
Jack suggested. Though William didn't like the idea of them splitting up, he agreed and watched Jack hurry back to the horse. After a final glance to make sure the man was still out, William continued around the house until he found the back door. It was locked, as William assumed it would be, and as the front door undoubtedly would be too. William looked around for a rock to break the window. It wouldn't be quiet, but hopefully Jack would follow soon to give him backup. He found the perfect rock a few feet away and tore a piece from his shirt to wrap his hand. It wouldn't block all the noise, but it might make it quiet enough that he could get in without attracting attention, and it would keep the glass from cutting him. With his knuckles wrapped and the rock in his hand for extra power, William tapped the glass as hard and as quietly as he could. Shards flew into the room, tinkling as they hit the floor. Though it probably wasn't that loud, it sounded like explosions to William's ears. He shoved his arm in, feeling around for the lock on the door. When his fingers found it, he opened the lock and slipped inside, his gun drawn for protection.
Well, who do we have here?"
The voice was hard and cold, and though William had never heard John Holden speak, he assumed the voice belonged to him. He looked up to find 2 Colts and a shotgun pointed down at him. Not even his quick shooting would get him out of this one.
"Tie him up with the others, boys."
William allowed one of the men to snatch the gun from his hand. Fighting now would be useless, but he would keep his eye open for a chance to escape or signal Jack. The other man bound his wrists behind his back and hauled him to his feet. William surveyed the room as he did. He had come in the back and landed squarely in the kitchen, which opened into the living room. Mabel, and the man William presumed was her husband, sat bound and gagged on the couch. Their eyes were wide with fear, but they appeared unharmed. A small child sat between them, tears streaming down his cheeks. The man unceremoniously shoved William onto the couch, causing him to fall against Mabel.
"Don't worry, everything will be all right,"
he whispered to her, before the man pulled him back up.
"So glad you could join us, Wild Bill."
The snide tone of Holden's voice infuriated William, but he kept his mouth shut.
"Now where is Hardesty? I assume you didn't come here all alone." "I'm not sure what you mean."
William shrugged and kept his voice casual.
"I was just coming to visit my sister."
A loud, coarse laugh burst from Holden's throat.
"Don't play me for a fool. Your sister barely acknowledged your existence. It was only when I pointed this here gun in her face that she remembered who you were."
William smiled his hurt at the words. He assumed Mabel was still suffering over the death of their mother, but it still stung. However, he had no time to dwell on that right now. Right now, he needed to distract Holden long enough to give Hardesty time to discover the broken back door. William hoped Hardesty would listen long enough to decide his best bet was the front door. It wasn't a great plan, but William hoped Hardesty's entrance would surprise the men long enough for him to rush Holden.
"Well, you got me," William said.
"Then why are you smiling?"
the man who had tied him up asked. He had dark hair, dull eyes, and a dopey grin.
"Shut up, Ernest."
Holden turned on the man with daggers in his eyes.
"I'm smiling," William answered in a loud voice, ignoring the tension between the two men, "because I know Hardesty is out there with the sheriff and the other rangers right now just waiting to take you down. The three of you don't stand a chance."
The other man, blonde and a little meaner looking, glanced over at Holden.
"Maybe we should sneak out the back. I don't want to go back to prison again." "No one is going anywhere,"
Holden roared. But with his attention on the blonde, he didn't notice Ernest pulling the curtain aside to look out the front window. In quick succession, there was a loud bang, a scream, the sound of breaking glass, and a thud as Ernest hit the floor. William figured this was his chance, and before Holden could aim the gun at them, he charged him. Another shot and a stinging sensation erupted in his arm, but he connected with Holden and his gun went flying. The front door flew open then, and someone took the blonde out before he could fire a shot. William landed on Holden and punched at his face until Hardesty and the sheriff pulled William off.
"Thanks for making it on time, Clarence."
William breathed a sigh of relief as the sheriff secured Holden.
"Well, I couldn't let you boys have all the fun. As soon as I asked around about Holden, the bartender told me he'd come into town last night asking about you. I hightailed it here as fast as I could, and I guess it's a good thing I did. You may go by William now, but you still act like the Wild Bill I read about in the papers."
William ignored the comment and turned his attention to Jack as he cut off the rope securing his hands.
"Thanks for not letting me down."
Two other men rushed to Mabel, her husband and child, and cut their ropes off as well.
"Thanks for speaking loud enough for us to hear."
Hardesty's eyes widened.
"William, you've been shot."
William touched his arm and tried not to grimace.
"I think it's just a scratch."
"Let's get it looked at anyway."
William nodded and watched as Ernest, the blonde, and Holden were all led out of the house by the sheriff and a few of the townsmen.
"Did you tell them about the other one outside?"
"I did. He's being taken care of."
Jack turned and looked at Mabel and her family.
"I'll go get the town doctor."
As Jack Hardesty walked out of the house, William turned his attention to Mabel.
"Are you okay?"
Mabel glanced at her husband before answering.
"Shaken, but I think we're okay. William, I'm sorry about what Holden said. I thought he'd let us go if I told him we weren't talking."
"It's okay, Mabel. I understand."
Mabel nodded and turned to her husband.
"I'd like you to meet my son Charles and my husband David. David, this is my half-brother William."
"Thank you for coming to rescue us."
David stood and stepped toward William, his hand out to shake William's. William nodded and shook the outstretched hand.
"You are welcome. I'm just sorry my past caught up with you. It's not who I am anymore."
He looked directly at Mabel, hoping she could see how he'd changed from the impulsive young man she'd known. Mabel bit her bottom lip and her eyes dropped to the floor a moment before meeting his gaze again.
"William, I'm so sorry for the way I acted before. These last few years, David,"
she smiled at her husband,
"has shown me how wrong I was to turn my back on you. You are the only family I have, and while I would never wish that man on anyone, I am rather glad he brought you back into my life."
With those words, complete and utter joy filled William. Mabel took a timid step toward him as if unsure how to proceed. He opened up his good arm and she rushed into it, wrapping her arms around him. As tears flooded his eyes, William wasn't sure who was happier. Mabel wiped tears from her own eyes as she leaned back and looked up at William.
Please tell me you can stay for dinner with us."
William thought about Emma waiting for him back home. He wanted to get back home to her, but he had a chance to reconnect with his sister, and he was sure Emma would understand.
"Of course I will."
Jack and the doctor showed up a few minutes later, and David showed them the bedroom where William could have a little privacy while the doctor examined his arm.
"You're very lucky," the man said as he finished wrapping the bandage. "The bullet barely grazed your arm, but you'll need to keep the bandage on for a few days and clean the wound to avoid infection." "Thank you, sir. I can do that."
As the doctor left, Jack pulled William to the side.
"I can't thank you enough. I will personally make sure Holden doesn't escape again, so we can keep your family safe. All of them."
His eyes slid to Mabel and her husband.
"Thank you, Mr. Hardesty,"
David said, as he led Jack to the front door.
"I don't want to think about what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Just doing my duty, but I'm also glad things turned out as well as they did."
With that, he tipped his hat and headed out.
"Why don't Charles and I rustle up dinner so you two can catch up?"
David asked, taking the child's hand and leaving Mabel and William alone in the living room. As an uncomfortable silence fell on them, the two took a seat on the couch. Mabel cleared her throat and then her gaze fell to the floor.
"I was sorry to hear about Catherine. I should have been there for the wedding and the funeral. I'm sorry."
William swallowed the emotion that erupted at the mention of Catherine's name.
"Thank you. I wish you had known her. She was a beautiful woman."
"You don't live here anymore. Where did you go when you left?"
"Honestly, I simply needed to get out. Catherine's memory was everywhere around here, so I left and joined the Texas Rangers. From there, I was introduced to bounty hunting, which I did up until recently."
"What happened recently?"
Mabel's eyes finally pulled from the floor and met his gaze. William smiled as images of Emma flooded his mind.
"I met another woman. Her name is Emma, and she's waiting for me back at Sage Creek. I asked her to marry me."
A smile lighted Mabel's features.
"That's wonderful, William. When is the wedding to be?"
"As soon as possible. We hadn't set a date yet, but after today, I want to marry her as soon as I can."
"You should make the most of the time you have together."
Mabel placed a hand on his arm and stared into his eyes.
"You never know when it will end."
William knew she was talking about the death of her parents, their mother in particular.
"Mabel, I'm so sorry about Mother."
"No, I'm sorry, William. I was angry because I didn't believe in God like Mother did. I couldn't believe a loving God would take her away when I needed her. But David showed me how bad things happen in life, but God's love keeps us going. He reminded me that this world is not our home and that I'll see Mother again someday."
William glanced toward the kitchen.
"You found a good husband, Mabel. I'm so pleased that God sent you a strong Christian man."
Mabel's smile turned from a wistful one to one full of love.
"Me too. Now, I know we aren't close, but you better send a telegraph when you have that wedding planned. I want to be there and meet this Emma."
"I'll do that."
William placed his hand on top of Mabel's and squeezed it, glad that God had brought them back together at last.